We are so excited about tonight's program. Thank you so much for spending your time here tonight. I know some people have been attending a lot of webinars, especially this past year, but I guarantee that this one is going to be beneficial. Tonight, we have a great program planned with practical information that you can use right away. Dana Littlefield, she brings 20 years of professional writing experience as the public safety editor at the San Diego Union-Tribune. She has written about numerous high-profile civil and criminal cases and appeared on local and national television to discuss the cases she's covered. She currently leads a team of reporters who cover breaking news, including stories about crime, fire, and other emergency situations. She also writes about policing and social justice, including the protest last summer when thousands of people took to the streets locally and around the globe in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. She has taught journalism classes for Southwestern College, and she currently holds a lecturer position at San Diego State University. She's also a longtime member of NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists, and is a past local chapter president. Tonight, once again, be sure to make sure you can pose those questions because it's not every day that you'll be able to speak directly to an editor and have your questions answered directly. So make sure you get those written and shared, and I'll be sure to monitor that. And we'll save questions once again at the end. So with that, I will toss it over to Dana. And Dana, thank you so much for being part of this presentation and leading this presentation and being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Ebony. It's my pleasure to be a part of this program. I very much appreciate the invitation. My goal here tonight is basically just to share some of my personal experiences and some tips and tricks that I've picked up over the years that I've been working. And I hope that that is helpful to some of you. That's essentially my approach here. I will say that, yes, Ebony is right. I have been at the Union-Tribune for more than 20 years. I actually hit my 21-year mark in July. I wasn't an editor for all of that time. I've been an editor now just for about 4 years. So the bulk of my time at the paper has been spent as a reporter. And I very much enjoy doing that work. But becoming an editor and leading a team of really, really talented reporters has been an education for me as well. Working with other people and, checking their stories line by line and, working collaboratively to figure out what is the best way to tell this story has been really educational. And so I appreciate them for that. And hopefully they appreciate what I contribute to what it is that they do. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and dive in. So let's see here. I'm gonna, if you all don't mind, I'm gonna share a few slides with you to help me on this course. Ebony mentioned that I'm a lecturer at San Diego State, which is a fancy way of saying that I like to talk. So let's go ahead and get this rolling. I'm gonna share my screen. Bear with me just a moment, please. I should be able to call this up right away. All right, so I was asked to speak on a number of themes. One of them being, how to get yourself unstuck. And, I've heard it said many, many times in this business that, we don't have time to wait for the muse to come down and enlighten us all and say, here is the perfect lead for your story. It just doesn't work like that. I know that I am speaking to a group of professionals here, so I'm assuming that all of you know what it's like to work on a deadline. So, but in terms of getting myself unstuck, because that happens to the best of us, when we're sitting there and we're like, I don't know how to start this story. There are a couple of little tricks and things that I have done to kind of force myself to get going. One of those has been to have, an editor standing over my shoulder yelling, get something on the screen. We don't always have that, right? So really, and I recognize that this isn't probably the most, enlightening tip that I can give you, but I'm going to start with it anyway and say, just start. Just start. Get something on the page, get something on the screen. You can make it pretty later. This is what I tell my students of various ages. I've worked for years with college students. I've worked for years with high school students in an annual journalism workshop that I do through the National Association of Black Journalists. And it pains me to see anyone sitting in front of the computer screen, just waiting and thinking and, hoping that at some point the perfect lead will spring forth from their brains and land onto that screen. What I tell them is just start writing. I don't care how ugly it is. Just tell me what the news is and get it on the screen. We're self-editing, right? So go back and make it pretty. Take out the words, take out the weird stuff. In fact, I've been known when working with students to just have them tell me the story, and I serve as their stenographer. So talk to me, tell me what the story is, and I write it down. I type it down. And that sometimes includes all the ums and the uhs and the I thinks and I believes. I put all of that on the screen and I say, there it is, look at it. It's not pretty, but the news is in there. You know what the news is. So now go back and clean it up. Getting started is what helps you keep going. Again, I realize how obvious that sounds, but I do know that many of us will sit there, and wait and wait and wait until the perfect lead springs forth and, gives us the motivation to move forward. And I also know that most of us do not have time to wait for that to happen. My second point here along these same lines is that you don't necessarily have to start your story when writing at the beginning. Start with what resonates with you, with what moves you. We're human beings with feelings and emotions, and something about that story, I would argue, in most cases, there's something there that resonated with you, even if it's something that's not particularly sexy, right? We reporters have gone out and written about, redistricting and about, sewer lines and trash pickup and, these things that might not necessarily be the most exciting topics, on a surface level. But somebody cares about these things. Or, there's something about it that's going to affect people's real lives. Something in that story somewhere will resonate with you, even if it's something as basic as, I need somebody to come pick up this trash and take it out of my house. Something will cause that little flicker in your heart and in your gut. Start there. Now that thing, whatever it may be, may not end up being the thing that appears at the top of your story. It might not be your lead, okay? It might be something that you have a pretty good idea should appear somewhere in the middle of your story. Or maybe it's that fantastic ending that you want to go out on, okay? Get that on the screen right away. Get something on the screen. You can fill in the rest. And I found this to be particularly helpful when writing on a very tight deadline. For example, out covering a city council meeting that, where my item that I'm covering ends at 8:30 and I need to get a story in by 9:15 at the latest, okay? So just start with the thing that was either the news itself or something that helps illustrate the news, something that resonated with me. And that might be, a quote that I plan to put at the end of the story. That may be something that one of the council members said that I thought was especially interesting or, infuriating, whatever it is. And I know that that's going to need to be somewhere high up in my story, but maybe not the lead. Get it on the screen. You don't have to start at the start of your story. I've started plenty of stories in the middle, but I've made my deadline. And that's the goal there. The last point here is, I mentioned quotes just a moment ago. Sometimes it's your sources who tell you where to start the story. Quite often it's your sources that tell you where to start the story. So you might want to take a moment, again, if you have the time, simply to write down the best quotes that you've gathered. So what appears on your screen is not, a fully formed lead and then, your nut graph and then a variety of, paragraphs with supporting information and then that cool little kicker at the end, all right? It might not come out of you that way. Instead, what you might need to do is take a moment just to take down the quotes that are interesting, the quotes that move you as the writer, and hopefully will do the same for your readers. And that might, once you get those quotes written down, that might show you how you should organize the story, okay? Let the source's words tell you where to start. That has happened in my experience many, many times. I'll give a quick example of that. I remember years and years ago writing a story about, I was covering a court case where there was a woman whose son was killed by another young man. It was a stabbing case, as I recall. And this woman, the victim's mother, stood up to give her victim impact statement in the courtroom at sentencing. And she chose to use that time to express that she had forgiven the person who killed her son. And the way that she expressed that in the courtroom was to sing a song. And so, to the surprise of many of us in there, she started singing this song. So, I believe I wrote a story that day. I wrote, just the daily story. Here's what the sentencing was. Here's this incredible thing that this woman did in the courtroom. Here's what other people said, blah, 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 your standard sentencing story. But my bosses at the time said, no, you need to come back at this and you need to write a feature story on this woman. And my thought at the time was, well, I've kind of already told her story. I've stolen the thunder already. So where do I begin with this? Well, what I did know was that I wanted to get the song in the story. So not just write that she sang a song, I wanted to put the lyrics in the story. Not just a segment of the lyrics, but I wanted to, put the full, what do you call it? Like a stanza that she had sang aloud in the courtroom. And so when it came time for me to sit down and write, I started there. I put that on the screen first, and I let the rest of the story take form around that. All right. It got me going. It got me out of my head where I was thinking, gosh, I've already stolen the thunder because I wrote a story yesterday and now I've got to write a story today on this very same subject. What do I do? Just getting those lyrics down and letting that get the juices flowing in terms of writing was helpful to me. So again, I knew that I wasn't going to lead my story with the lyrics of her song. That was not the way I wanted to go, but I knew it was going to be in there somewhere. And so when it came to the writing process, that's where I began. That's where I got going. And it helped. It helped me get out of my head. Moving on. Okay. So another theme that I wanted to go over here in this discussion is, how to use emotion effectively. It was mentioned previously that, I'd been a reporter for many years, somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 years for the Union-Tribune before I became an editor. And, I realize it's very odd to say this the way I'm going to say it, but, if you're writing a story and you want your story to have emotion in it, well, in a criminal court setting, the emotion is built in. So it's not like I had to go searching for it. I wasn't writing about the sewer lines and had to, find who was emotional about, the sewer lines running under and away from their house. I was dealing with people I was writing about people who were dealing with the most tragic experiences in their lifetimes. And so it's all there. It's right there in front of me. So how to handle that, how to give that the respect it deserves without making it overblown or without alienating the readers. These are all things that you have to contend with when you have that kind of emotion. And I want to say that I recognize that not every story that you write going forward is going to be about something that emotional, a murder case, or, a sexual assault case, or whatever else, whatever other ugly, emotional, tragic thing that might be out there. Sometimes we do have to search for that emotion. So here we go. Let's go through a few points here about how to handle it when you have found that emotion and want to share it in your story. My first tip is that you should check the tone, okay? You want to be very, very careful with the tone of your story. I'm a big, big fan of writing conversationally, and I know that I'm speaking to a group of journalists, and so you are very aware that as journalists, we tend to write in a style that's much more conversational than you would say if you were writing for a trade publication, or you were writing for a, writing an academic paper. Of course, those tend to have a much more formal tone. So while, yes, indeed, we are more conversational, if you're dealing with, a murder case, you don't want your conversational tone to come off as glib or dismissive or overly playful, right? You certainly don't want that. But you also want it to be accessible, and you want the story to flow well. Again, you will hear me in this presentation, speak about writing in a conversational style a lot, because that is a big one with me. And again, I know that that is, one of our kind of core concepts as journalists. But, there are levels. I'm sure if you were to compare, my writing to somebody else's, you would find that my writing might be a little bit more conversational and a little bit less conversational than that other writer. Sure, okay. But my point is this. You want to make sure that the tone of your story fits the subject. Again, I realize that might sound obvious, but I have encountered many a story where the tone was just a little bit off. You can feel it as you're reading that story. And sometimes for the writer, it's hard to pick up on that right away. And if you have the time, I strongly suggest getting away from that story for even, a few minutes, if that is possible. Get away from it, do something else, and go back and read it again with fresh or fresher eyes. And you can ask yourself, does the tone of this, does it actually fit? Okay? Is the emotion misplaced? Or is the emotion not striking the right note the way I have framed it here in this story? That's something that you want to be very, very, very careful of. So there's that. Also, when you are writing a story that's filled with emotion, or that has some emotional elements in it, and all the best stories do, by the way, have some emotion in it. Who wants to read something that's dry and devoid of humanity? All right. But you want to vary the levels. You can't be level 10 through the whole story. All right. Sometimes you got to pull it back down to level 6, maybe go all the way down to level 2, and then you come back up to level 9 and 10. Just like when you're watching a movie, right? If that movie starts out at level 10 and stays at level 10 through the whole thing, that is exhausting for the person who is taking all that in. If you start at level 10 and end at level 10, that's, Fast and the Furious, and we're not doing that. All right. You want to vary the levels of emotion in your story so that your reader can take a breath from time to time. Okay. All right, let's see what's going to happen next. This is particularly true when you're writing a story that's in a narrative format, where you've got the space in the room to tell a story somewhat slowly. All right. So yeah, you certainly want to vary those levels. Start out with high emotion and then pull back a little bit and get into the explanation there. Now, I realize what I'm saying. I'm comparing, this type of storytelling, this journalism that we're doing, I'm comparing it to, what you would see in a movie, right? Well, I recognize that you are dealing with the truth, and you have to present the truth throughout your story. And maybe the truth of your story that it is at level 10 all the way through. Okay. But I would suggest to you to find those quiet moments, because those are important too. They're not only true to the story that you tell, but they also provide some relief, a moment for your reader, your audience, to take a breath before that next big explosive emotional moment. All right, so look for authenticity. Again, I'm guessing some of you are reading that or hearing me say that and saying, well, Dana, we're journalists. We're dealing with information that is accurate. We're always looking for authenticity. I see you, I hear you, I understand you, of course. But you might find yourself where you're in a situation, and again, you all are trained to look for when something doesn't ring true or something seems off. And I ask you to listen to that voice. You know, we've had times, I know I have had times where maybe I haven't listened to that voice and it has come back to bite me. All right. But if you are in a situation where you're doing an interview and the person is very emotional and something about it seems off, you know, please don't make that your lead. You know, I've run into that pitfall and it hurt. It hurt a lot. So be careful about that. Watch for those moments that to you as a emotional human being, those times when that emotion rings a little bit false. What I also mean when I'm talking about the authenticity of a moment in terms of emotion is that for us as storytellers, there can be a tendency to perhaps maybe emphasize those emotional moments, and we can perhaps unintentionally kind of overblow those moments, kind of inflate them too much, shine too harsh of a spotlight on those emotional moments, and inadvertently distort them. You don't want to do that, okay? So pay attention to when, you know, you're getting into soap opera territory. You know, you're reading your story and it's time to pull out the fainting couch, right? These things that just aren't reading as authentic. They don't feel real in the story. That's not to say that that person who's talking to you wasn't actually sad or wasn't actually mad or wasn't actually whatever else, whatever other kind of emotion that we might be talking about at that particular moment. But again, you have to kind of calibrate. You have to make sure that you are turning the dial appropriately. Here's where we turn it up a bit. And here's where this person was really getting emotional. And so I'm going to illustrate that in my story. I'm going to focus on that. But later, when she's talking about X, Y, and Z, I'm going to pull that dial back a bit. Again, it speaks to the levels that I was talking about previously. We want to make sure that those levels accurately represent the person, accurately represent the moment. And again, I cannot stress how important it can be to walk away from the story. Take a breath. You know, if you can, take an hour, take, you know, a few hours, take a day before you go back to that story and look at it specifically for those, to do an authenticity check, an emotional authenticity check, to make sure that what you have presented to your audience rings true on an emotional level. I mentioned the fainting couch just moments ago. I'll go back to that. You know, you don't want your story to read like a soap opera, right? You want to avoid being too maudlin. Now, again, in my experience, having covered courts for many, many years, I saw some very, very emotional moments in courtrooms and in courthouse hallways and outside the courtroom. And I went to interview people in their homes, people who were involved in these court cases, and talk to them about what they had experienced. And these were, you know, deeply, deeply emotional moments. But I had to make sure, and this came with practice over years, I had to make sure that I wasn't leaning so hard into that emotion, even though it was authentic, even though it was accurate, but that I wasn't veering into, you know, soap opera drama in the retelling of that story. It's an easy trap to fall into because we as reporters, we as writers, we as broadcasters, you know, want to put all of that in there, because that's what grabs a reader. That's what grabs an audience. That's what makes people care, seeing that person's humanity in your story. But we can, in those moments, go too far. We can pour on too much syrup and make it so, sticky, sticky sweet, or so sad that it is off-putting. And we certainly don't want to do that. I remember years ago, I was writing a story. Excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of my tea here. I was writing a story about, it was a kind of an odd story and a difficult, this was one where it was kind of difficult to get the right tone, because I was writing about a man who was accused of murder. He had not yet been convicted, but he was accused of murder. And I happened to find out from the attorney who was representing him at the time that in the course of her preparation to defend this man, that she had found his biological father. Not only had the biological father not ever known his son, but the biological father didn't know until that moment that the son existed. So let me explain that a little bit more clearly. So one day this man gets a call from a lawyer who says, hey, guess what? You have a son. He's 40. He's accused of murder. I bet you didn't know any of this. And the guy's like, what? Okay. I mean, it was a mind-blowing moment. And I wanted to tell that story. And so I did. I interviewed the attorney. I was able to get some comments from the man who was in custody. I was able to talk to the biological father who got this bombshell landed on him, and a variety of other people connected to this case. And I did speak to the mother that he grew up with. And so I had in the story, all these comments about how much the mother who raised him loved him and cared for him, and is so shocked by the fact that he was accused of this, grisly, horrible crime. And I had those references in the story. They appeared again and again in the story. And my editor said to me at the time, he was like, we get it. She loved him, even though he's a murderer. We get it. You don't have to keep telling us that. And, I got it. I was laying it on too thick. It was a trap that I had fallen into. And I tried to hang on to that lesson going forward. Don't let it get too maudlin. Don't let it get too, I guess sticky sweet is not exactly the right phrase to use in reference to that particular story, but I think you all understand what I'm getting at. What I was reporting was accurate, but it was also too much, and it threw off the tone of the story. And so I needed to be careful of that. That was a good lesson that I've carried with me for many, many years. Moving on. Another of the themes that I was asked to discuss this evening has to do with finding your voice as a writer. So the best that I can do here is to describe how I've found mine. I'm sure if you find someone else out there, he or she or they might have, the formula for finding your voice as a writer. But what I can tell you is that it was not something that I actively crafted, that I actively built and developed. Instead, it was something that emerged over time. It's like a signature. You're not the person who invented signing one's name, okay? You didn't do that all by yourself, but your signature is yours, all right? Your special way of doing it. And there might be some similar signatures out there, but they're not exactly like yours. And so that's what I'd like to describe to you here, how I kind of found rather than crafted my own voice that I think comes through in my writing. Here's where we go back to that conversational style of writing. Well, actually, before I get to that, I have a point that I want to make before that. So I should pay attention to the slides that are in front of all of us. So pay attention to what you are drawn to in other people's writing, right? There is that, old chestnut out there. How do you become a better writer? Is by being a reader. And that is absolutely true. Read as much as you can and actually take the time to recognize what it is that you like about this writer versus that writer. And, I mean that across different styles of writing. We're talking about, journalism, short form, long form. If we're talking about, fiction writing, the stylistic choices that can be made in every type of writing can be applied in the kind of writing that you are focusing on. So pay attention to that, make a mental note of it, make an actual note of it. Because it's not about copying somebody else's style. I'm not suggesting that, but it will help you identify what it is that you like, what it is that you are drawn to. And it will help you also figure out what it is you don't like and what is, causes an aversion to, you to shy away from certain types of writing. And it will help you identify what is special about what you do, about how you communicate to an audience through your writing. This happens over time. In my experience, I didn't read other people's writing and then build my own formula. It didn't come together that way. Instead, I recognized what it is I liked in other people's writing. For example, I really like brevity. Some of you may be listening and say, well, you don't sound like you like brevity, going on and on and on. Well, that's true, okay? But I like short, tight sentences. I like writing that, where you can easily flow from paragraph to paragraph. So I like those paragraphs to be tight. And I like, how we often do in journalism, well, we might throw in a sentence fragment, or we might concentrate on the rhythm of a few, staccato sentences or something like that. I enjoy that much more than really, really dense writing. Toni Morrison, national treasure. She is a very dense writer. The writing is very dense. It's very, it's tough to get through for a lot of people. And she is one of my favorites, but she doesn't write in a style that I can emulate. That's just not what I'm drawn to in my own writing. Again, national treasure. All right, so moving on from that. Here's where I want to come back to the conversational aspect of the writing that we do. Use the rhythms of your own speech patterns, the cadence of your voice when speaking in different settings. Pay attention to that, and you can infuse some of that into your writing. Now, again, I'm going to bring up that word that I did previously, tone, right? You don't want to be trying to be so fancy with the rhythms of your writing that it is off-putting to the reader, and that it gives kind of an unintended, inappropriate tone to what it is you are writing about, right? So if, for example, if the rhythms of your writing come off as playful and you're writing about a triple homicide, that doesn't really work too well. All right, so you want to be careful about that sort of thing, for sure. But that said, it can be fun to play with those rhythms in your stories. And there are ways to do that in writing, no matter the subject matter. If you're writing about fluffy bunnies or you're writing about the triple homicide, there is a way to do that that is appropriate for that story. And those rhythms and cadence of your own speech, that's you. That's you inserting yourself in a story that is appropriate, not making it about you, because we as journalists do not want to do that. It's not about us, it's about the subject matter. But that's a way of infusing a little bit of your, the thing that makes you special as a storyteller into your work. And that, not for nothing, that is why one of the reasons why people are reading your stuff, all right? Yes, those of us who work in news, we know that the audience is drawn by the subject matter. But I would wager that many of you out there have been told that, a reader especially likes the way that you write about XYZ subject matter. That's because you put your voice in it. You told someone else's story in your way. And that's what we're trying to get at here, okay? Now take some time to get rid of, phrasing that has become habitual or rote. We all have these little verbal things that we do over and over and over. They become habit, right? Try to get rid of those things. I remember there was a time while I was covering courts where it started to feel like I was, writing stories. It was like paint by numbers, like I was writing from a template. Oh, this is an arraignment story. Here's what goes in the lead. Here's what goes in the second paragraph. Here's, paragraphs 3, 4, 5, bing, bang, boom, done. On to the next. And I had to, at one point, stop myself and go, this is not the way you want to be doing this. Are you telling the stories? Are you telling, truthful information? Are you telling accurate information? Yes. Are you following your journalistic ethics? Yes. But are you stretching yourself as a writer? No. And so I had to kind of check myself and go, let me take the time. I know I'm on deadline and I know I've got 3 stories to file, but let me take an extra moment to see if there's another way I can get into this story, even if it's just the arraignment story where we know the defendant is going to plead not guilty because it's a felony case. And, we don't know for sure if the prosecutors are going to put any information on the record at all. And we don't know if the defense attorney is going to talk to us at all. But let's see if there's a way that we can write the story. We, listen to me, who's the we? The way that I can write this story in a way that's different from some of the others. Let me shake it up a bit. Let me put a little bit of me in there, in the sense of the story is coming through me. It's not about me. So I had to kind of check myself on that. And I encourage you all to do the same. Am I falling into a pattern? Because that pattern, I would suggest to you, is not the same as being part of your signature, as being indicative of your voice as a writer. I think that's simply a habit, a crutch even, that it would be good for all of us to break when those emerge. All right, so what can I do now? Let me show you some examples of what I'm talking about. Hopefully these links are working. Okay, that was not one that this is what I want to do. Excuse me just a second. Go back here. Nope, got this on here twice, and that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, of course I hit a hitch. All right, so I wanted to show you, let's see if I can pull it up really, really quickly. Union-Tribune, that's me, let's try my name, and let's do opinion. There was an opinion piece that I wrote some time ago, was asked by our editorial director to write something. I'm going to see if I can find it right away. And the thing about this that made me very nervous was that, I don't write opinion pieces. That is not my jam. That is not something that I do. And so this particular task really threw me. I wanted to be so careful about what I said. I wanted to be, but I also didn't want it to be boring, of course, and I wanted it to sound like me. And I wasn't sure initially how to hit all those points. I think that I did. I mean, I'm sure that opinions can vary as to whether or not I was successful in it, but I will share with you something that I was told. I hope he's okay with me sharing this. Matt Hall said to me after this ran, he said, there's a particular line in the piece where he said, I could hear you saying that. And I'm just going to read that to you. Basically, this was an editorial piece that ran in January, ran on January 15th. And excuse me if I'm making your eyes go all blurry because I'm scrolling too quickly. But I want to just kind of share a little bit of it with you, if you will bear with me. So it starts as follows. 12 years ago, on the day reserved to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I was preparing to witness a celebration of another Black man who left an indelible mark on US history. I was in Washington, D.C. for the inauguration of President Barack Obama. And so I'm referencing the time before Obama's first inauguration when I went to DC and I wrote a blog for the Union-Tribune about that experience. And I mentioned here in the story, the trip was, in a word, exhilarating. When we get here, I'm giving you some facts that I'm sure some of you remember quite well. More than 1.8 million people attended Obama's first inauguration on January 20th, 2009. Getting around the city at the time was exceedingly difficult. The crowds were like nothing I'd experienced before or since. And it was cold, bitterly cold. I'm from San Diego, I don't do cold. And that was the line. This one right here was the one who, Matt Hall, who heads our, opinion, the group of journalists who write our opinion pieces. He was the one who told me, I read that and I could hear you saying it. And I don't know if he knows this, but that to me was a big compliment because I got my voice in there. It sounded like me. And that's what I wanted. That's what you want in an opinion piece. That's what you want in an editorial. You don't want something that's, so dry and bland that it could have come from anyone. So, is this a line that really moves the story I'm trying to tell forward? Maybe not so much. It's not the most important bit of information, but it's a little bit of my personality, just a smidge. And that's the kind of thing that shows the reader who you are. One of the things that shows the reader who you are. So I was proud of that moment. Let me go back to my slides. Of course, now I'm realizing that maybe I didn't do this the way I should have, but that happens. All right. See, they're all coming up the same, even though they're listed as different. I've got different links on there. Okay, let me fix this. So I will look up another story that I wrote many years ago. Okay, here it is. All right. I carved out kind of a niche for myself inadvertently over the years when I was covering courts. I've written a lot of stories that focus specifically on mothers. I talked to you all previously about a story I'd written about, the mother who sang in court, and I see the time, so I'm going to speed up a bit here. But this was a story about a mother whose son was accused of committing a crime. He had actually killed another boy. And so I got an interview with her and she told me her story here. And again, you can see here these, it's not even a full sentence. And I started a story with a date. In your journalism 101 class, they'll tell you don't do this, all right? But these little stylistic things, I like to do them and they've become part of my voice. So here is the top of this story before I move on. It starts January 16th, 2021, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We got a bit of a theme here, right? Theme. 3 boys were enjoying a day off from school in East County when playtime turned to tragedy. They were playing in a mobile home park, teaming up for a mock battle with Nerf swords. I like a lot of detail in a story. Again, I realize, you might have learned that in your journalism 101 class, but you don't see it in every single story. So I tried to pack as much detail in here to make it visual, to make the writing visual. When one of the kids was left without a partner. One of the best lessons that I have received came from one of my former editors, and I will shout her out here, from Laura Wingard, who told me when writing this story, I was struggling with the lead because I was trying to shorten it. And she told me, forget about that. We're told not to waste the reader's time, get to your nut graph right away, the nut graph that, tells the reader what the news is. She told me, set that aside for now, break the rule and just tell the story of what happened on that day. So what you see here are paragraph after paragraph of this mother telling what unfolded on that day. And we don't get to my actual nut graph until here. I've never written a story like that previously, but I took the time to tell what was a tragic yet fascinating story. I just let it go. I let it flow through me. I used the source's words, but I told the story in my way, hopefully in a way that was vivid, without turning it into a soap opera. That was my goal here. And lastly, I will go to that story that keeps popping up before I intended it to. I'll just go ahead and search for it. Here we go. This was a story that published last year. It is a long one. Some of you might remember the disappearance of 2-year-old Jahi Turner in 2002, while his mother was deployed on a Navy ship. And his mother, when I spoke to her, basically the focus of the story was going to be, she has lived all of these years without ever really knowing what happened, without ever getting confirmation of what happened. And so this story is chock full of emotion. But another editor told me that when she read this, it didn't come off to her as being maudlin, this soap opera version of what you said. I tried to stay faithful to her authentic emotion throughout. That was my goal, but still telling the story with her words in my voice. And with that, I do see that we're kind of running short on time. I see Ebony back on screen, so I will put a pin in what I was saying here and turn it over to you, Ebony.
No, Dana, please just finish up. I'm not going to wrap you up just yet. You have a few more minutes before we take it off to questions. And now is a good time, if you haven't already submitted a question, to go ahead and do that, because the next portion of the presentation will be question and answer.
Okay, well, then I'll just take another moment or two to just kind of highlight the top of this story. So again, it begins this way. For more than a decade, Tamika Jones held on to the idea, a fantasy really, that her son would come home one day. This is my voice. These are kind of my verbal, tics, for lack of a better way of putting it, where when I'm speaking, I often interrupt myself, interject a phrase or a thought. And so you'll see this in a lot of my writing. A fantasy, really, that's conversational. I also think it was fair to say that her holding on to this idea that her son would come home one day was indeed a fantasy. And so that's the way I wrote it. She believed it in April 2002 when she got a call from her then husband, the man she trusted to care for 2-year-old Jahi Turner while she was deployed on a Navy ship off San Diego. "Baby, I can't find Jahi. The police are here," she recalled hearing as she stood on the smoke deck of the USS Rushmore, her hand trembling as she held the phone. Jones, then just 18, was certain she'd see Jahi again, even as police told her they didn't believe her husband's version of how the boy disappeared. She kept believing it as weeks, months, and years went by without charges filed or a body found. Maybe I'm the only one who hears it, but there's a rhythm to the words. And it's one that I try to keep up, that I try to vary throughout the telling of this story, so that it doesn't turn into, an academic paper like the ones I used to write back in the day, that were very kind of, staid and devoid of emotion. I wanted to let her story drive how this was told. I wanted to use her emotion and use her words, but tell it in my way. And I think that I was able to do that here. I'll read just a bit more before I go quiet on you. Now divorced and living in Maryland, Jones has tried to deal with the shock, anger, and denial. I like those little groupings of three descriptions that washed over her in waves over the past year. I do have to watch myself that I don't do that so much that it becomes one of those habits. She says she knows it's unlikely that Jahi is still alive, especially after viewing evidence from the investigation, evidence considered in 2018 by a San Diego jury. But she still has questions and hopes that one day maybe she'll get answers. Again, conversational. That's what I was trying to do here, and I hope that I was successful. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Ebony. I don't know if there are any questions, but I'm happy to answer any if they pop up.
I for one have a question. I've actually been monitoring the chat right now, so I'll look again. But I did have a question. Going from being a long time reporter and then transitioning to an editor, what can reporters do to better prepare themselves to be ready for possibly a deep edit, especially when you've worked so hard on the copy? It might be hard or difficult to get that edit.
Yeah, I think you should go in being ready to compromise. But that said, don't let the editor completely block out your voice. That was one of the lessons that I had to learn, and perhaps I'm still learning as a relatively new editor, that, simply because that reporter wrote this story that way and it didn't sound like me, it doesn't mean it's wrong. You have to, as the editor, you have to preserve that writer's voice, even though it might not sound quite right to you because it isn't the way you would write it. And I readily admit that, especially early on, there were times where I would, change a thing here and there. And I've learned over time, I didn't have to change those things because it wasn't about the facts of the case. It was simply about the style. It was simply about the voice. And it is my job to back up off of that and let that writer tell the story in his or her or their own voice. Now, that said, there are going to be things where I'm like, no, I can't, I don't, I don't like it. Can we say this a different way? And so the best interactions that I have had with editors have been when I've written something, they've come back and they've said, this doesn't work. And then I've suggested something else and we found that middle ground. So whatever it is, I'm going to borrow a line from Steve Padilla at the LA Times, who said in a presentation previously, not so long ago, he was saying something about, and I'm not going to get the wording exactly right, but he knew of an editor where that editor was clashing with reporters a lot because that editor was pretty heavy-handed and would come in and change things, which, pissed off the reporters, understandably. But the thing to realize is that even though this editor, probably suggested a fix that didn't work, the editor did identify a problem. And the reporter needs to recognize, well, okay, if you didn't like it the way I did it the first time, let's still change it, but let's find that middle ground solution where both of us are happy. So I say to reporters, go in prepared to find that middle ground. We each have to give up a little something. That's the way it works.
And you offered some examples of your writing, some very emotional stories, serious topics, subject matters, and you talked about working in the courts and reporting in the courts for a long time. I have a question. How do you keep that separation when you are speaking to mothers and you are maybe following a story for a long time and you speak to someone more than once? Mm-hmm. Have you ever had that line where they call you and they think that, how do you keep that professional separation? Because I know sometimes your editor or your producer might be encouraging you to try to get things exclusive sometimes. Mm-hmm. So you keep that line of communication open, but how do you let them know that you are this unbiased, neutral party?
Talk to them.
Yeah.
You make it clear what your job is. You do it in a way where you are telling them what the situation is, but in a way that hopefully isn't rebuffing them, And there are some times where you just have to be a human being. Quick example. I remember there was a story many years ago where two young people, I can't remember the ages specifically, but I think there was a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, two young children who were gunned down leaving a party somewhere in, I think it was, I can't remember the specific neighborhood, but it was somewhere in southeastern San Diego. And You know, clearly the community was distraught over the loss of these two young people. And I spent a lot of time talking to the mothers, one of the mothers in particular. And I remember seeing her at one point. You know, I wrote multiple stories about that case. And I ran into her outside the business office in the courthouse, and she came up and she hugged me. And my thought was like, oh God, you know, people are gonna see this and it's gonna make me look unprofessional and blah, 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 blah. You know, with some maturity later on, I realized, you know, I didn't, you know, rebuff her. I didn't, you know, rush her away or anything like that. But I have come to realize after that, so just hug her. That's what she needed in that moment. And that's real and genuine. And I can still write a story that's fair to the accused, you know, but give that woman what she needed in that moment. Sometime later, she invited me to an event. It was like a religious event. It was not my jam. It was not my thing, but she took the time. For some reason, she wanted me there. So I got up on the Sunday morning and I went and was just there and experienced it with her because that's what she wanted. You know, we're not besties, but that's what she needed. And it was okay for me to go there.
And we'll see if we can get maybe one more question in and try to wrap up on time. Dina asks, how do you handle dialogue in a story? Can you answer that quickly?
Yeah, so if you're talking about like a back and forth kind of dialogue between two parties, sometimes that can be really effective. But my suggestion would be keep that short. If you go back and look at that Jahi Turner story, there is one little segment where I do have that back and forth. It's a back and forth between the mother of Jahi and one of the detectives in the case. This kind of moment where things kind of came to a head between the two of them. So, you know, if you're going to do that back and forth, make sure it's worth it. You know, a real dramatic moment, a real authentic dramatic moment, and keep it short. You know, because a little bit of that goes a very long way.
And last question coming from a Nicole Larson, just to summarize what she's saying, I believe she's asking what happens if your editor inserts something in your story that's factually incorrect or grammatically incorrect. So I guess.
Hopefully you catch it before it goes into the paper. And I've had those moments where that's happened and I didn't catch it. You know, I've said, look, you know, no one wants to make a mistake. I've made mistakes. I've had to own up to those mistakes. It hurts, but you do it because that's what you're supposed to do, right? And I'm willing to do all of that. It is a special kind of hurt when somebody else puts that mistake in your story and your name is on it. But the response is the same. You have to own it, you know, to the public, because nobody cares if that mistake came from your editor or if it came from you. Your name is on the story. So just own it. But maybe then you need to have a conversation with the editor, you know, and say, look, you know, why did it go down like that? You know, as an editor, that's probably my biggest fear, that I'm going to insert an error into one of my reporters' stories. And so I'm constantly sending their stories back and saying, check my edits, check my edits.
Well, thank you so much. That is all the time we have. Thanks again to Dana Littlefield, the public safety editor of the San Diego Union-Tribune, for leading tonight's Write Better, Right Now series. I'm sure you found a lot of useful tips that you can apply right away. It was a pleasure speaking with you and getting your perspective. For more information about future San Diego Press Club events, go to sdpressclub.org, and this recording will be posted pretty soon on the Press Club's website and possibly to the Press Club's YouTube. So thank you again for being with us, everyone, and have a wonderful night. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.